to Running Fundamentals Part 2. This is Graham Tuttle, the Barefoot Sprinter. We're going to talk about shoes, specifically how to pick the right shoes. But before we get into the aspects of a good shoe and recommendations, it's important to remember that shoes are technology. And before we had the modern running shoe in about 1970 with foam and nice comfortable soles, we had nothing. That means we were barefoot for hundreds of thousands of years. Yes, humans have been using shoes and technology with plant or leather or metal, but before we had plastic and foam, we had to make do with what was available, and that wasn't very comfortable. So shoes were used as a status symbol, or they're used as technology, but they weren't the ubiquitous thing that we see now, meaning that every single person is always wearing the shoe. So what I want you to remember is that you have to think of the foot as distinct from the shoe. The problem is that if you believe and get sucked into the marketing of mainstream shoe companies, you might forget that. And you might think that all you need to run is the right shoe. And yes, some shoes are better than others, and some shoes have more specific use cases for running than others. But ultimately, you can do everything you need to do barefoot. And so with that, then you could say, you can build from the foundation that my feet are the most important part, and if I start from a strong, healthy, capable foot, the shoe adds to that. So, not all shoes are created equally. There are four aspects of a good shoe. It's flat, it's flexible, it's wide, and it's thin. It's flat, meaning the heel and toe are on the same level. Your foot is on the same level. It's zero drop, meaning your heel and toe are flat when you're barefoot. A shoe should mimic that. There is no reason other than aesthetic, you're looking taller, to have a raised heel. It's flexible, meaning the midsole is flexible and can bend. That's important because every single step you take is going to shape and remodel the bottom of your foot. If you don't have access to a shoe that's flexible, you will get stiff. And it may be 1 or 2 degrees you lose of flexion every single step, but after 10,000, 100,000, a million steps, that adds up. You want a shoe that's flexible. You want wide, or specifically foot-shaped. You want enough space for your foot to be able to wiggle, your toes to be able to wiggle. Again, we talked about this in part 1, but if you don't have access to moving your toes, you lose access to all the muscles of your foot, ankle, and lower leg, and that creates stiffness in the system, and that creates the higher likelihood of getting the tendinitis irritations that end up ruining most running careers. And fourth, and least important, is you want it to be thinner. Now, by thinner, I mean that the padding is a negotiation between your environment and your preference for how much discomfort you want to go through. So if you wear a super minimalist shoe where you can feel everything, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yes, when you walk on gravel, it does not feel good. You get a little bit more of a grounded centeredness on the ground. You can feel the terrain, but the amount of padding you have is up to you. That being said, the higher you go, the higher your likelihood of an ankle sprain is. So I like to keep it under 24 millimeters, which is about an inch or less. So 22 to 24 millimeters of stack height is the max I'd ever recommend, even for longer distances. Now, if you're looking at ultra marathons and things like above 40, 50, 100 miles, essentially that becomes glorified walking. And so that's a different conversation where you look at the Supermax shoe, but that's a sport in and of itself. Those types of sport-specific footwear make sense in that environment. But for every other part of regular running, a 22 or 24 millimeter stack height is the max you need. Now, the reality is if you go too low, you're going to end up putting a lot more load on your foot and more likelihood of stepping on rocks and getting aromas. I've had issues like that in the past. And that's fine. I mean, people run barefoot, so it really is a tolerance issue. But you got to realize that at some point, you can't let perfect be the enemy of good. If you want to wear 5 fingers or minimal sandals or run barefoot, that's absolutely fine. It's phenomenal. And it really helps you feel the ground, and it gives you the most connected sense of running. But if you want some padding underneath, that's fine. Because ultimately, the padding, if it's even and flexible and flat, you're not going to interrupt the running form. You can run correctly in any shoe. Some shoes just make it harder to do. Building off of that, it's important to know the difference between a training shoe and a competition shoe. There's a lot of super shoes that have a carbon fiber plate. If you're training for the max speed you can run in a 5K, a half marathon, or marathon, that's a sport. That's a decision you make to go and pursue a specific output. That's not to be confused with health. If you're trying to run and learn the art of running, you want something that gives you the most feedback possible. The reality is that most people skip the foundation, their feet aren't strong enough, they jump into running and they get trapped in the cult of more, and they think, I started with a 5K, I'm gonna do a 10K, do a half marathon, they go more and more and more, but they never do the strength training, they don't work on the form, and they can't move their feet, so they don't have a foundation, and then they end up getting hurt. And so they think, well, I can run in this shoe for 3 miles, but every time I go to 5 or 6 miles, my feet start to hurt. Maybe I need a different shoe. And they think that the more padding is gonna help them, but that's part of the marketing of the shoe companies, which says, buy the right shoe, buy the right product, and replace it every few months. It's kind of like a drug dealer. They need to get you hooked and need to get you coming back to the same thing over and over again. And I'm not saying that there isn't value in replacing your shoes and all that stuff, and value in having, fancy new foam because it does break down, whatever. There's value in some truth in it all. but it's a distraction from the fact that if you skip the foundation of having strong feet, you will end up in a spot where you're continually chasing the next bigger shoe, and eventually you're going to end up in Hokas and having multiple inches of padding, and it's never going to get better. So if you skip that and you wear a competition shoe and think that's going to solve for your lack of foundation, you will end up prolonging to bigger injuries and ultimately lose your ability to run in the long term. The next question is how to transition from a conventional shoe to a more minimalist or foot-friendly shoe. Now, I'll break this up into 4 different categories. First, you have your conventional shoes. That's going to be your Asics, your Brooks, your Saucony, or whatever it is. The typical shoe that has a raised heel, a lot of padding underneath, it's a stiffer midsole, got some type of pronation support, and it's going to have a tapered toe box. Horrible for you. And just because everybody wears them doesn't mean that they're any better. You gotta realize that most of these top runners are paid or sponsored by these shoe companies who are then going to wear the shoes. That doesn't necessarily mean it's ideal for them. But remember, the conventional shoe is not your friend when it comes to having a healthy, strong foot. After that, you don't have to go to a minimalist shoe, which just has no padding underneath. You can do what's a foot-friendly conventional shoe. I look at something like an Ultra Escalante Racer, which is going to have a wide toe box, it's flexible, it's flat, but it has enough padding, about that 22 to 24 millimeter stack height. That's going to give you enough space for your foot to be friendly, and I think that's a great option for road running, hard surfaces, or mid to long distance running. Even up to a marathon, I think that's more than fine. And you can start to work down to something like a minimalist shoe. Now, the thing to remember about minimalist shoes is that once you have any amount of separation from the ground to your foot, you are no longer getting the grounding earthing effect, meaning you're not getting the exchange of electrons. So even though it's flat, flexible, and wide, the thinness is just a comfort level. If you really like running in something like a Vivo or a Zero or a Field Grounds where you are basically 2 to 5 millimeters off the ground, that's absolutely fine. I don't think there's a benefit of doing that over a 12 to 20 millimeter stack height shoe when it comes to running well, because ultimately the flat, the flexible, and the wide are what make the difference. But if you enjoy the minimalist feel, then absolutely go for that. But then you can move to what I like. So if I'm gonna be in a minimalist shoe which is very thin, I like to be able to feel the ground but maximize my foot capacity. That's where I will wear a Vibram 5-finger or a Shama sandal, a Huarache style sandal, because it lets my foot maximally move, it separates the toes, and it engages the most natural feel of my foot while also being thin, but I'm not having the same. You have to realize that the conventional shoe shape that ties your feet together in one little lump and the socks that wrap around that, it's not really training your foot to be different. I think it's really important if you want to maximize your foot that you have differentiated toes. Now there's 2 parts of that. One is a shoe that has a separated toes, and 2 is a sock that has separated toes. Even if you're wearing no different shoes, you're just wearing the conventional shoes or super shoes, wearing toe socks is a huge game changer all the time. I'm a big fan of toe socks. But if you can wear toe socks inside of a toe separated shoe, that's even better. One shoe I'll add in here that's a new option is called the Peluva, P-E-L-U-V-A. It's a toe separated shoe with a little bit of padding. I'm a huge fan of my Vibram 5-fingers, but Peluva's taken that and added a little bit of padding underneath, which makes it much more accessible for most people. I think that's a fantastic option. So in general, I wear my Escalante Racers or my Peluva, which is a padded shoe with the 12 to 20 millimeter stack height for almost all road, mid or long distance running. And if it's sprinting or short distance running, I'm either in sandals, 5-fingers, or barefoot, optimally barefoot. But you think about the transition in that realm, because every transition you go from a conventional shoe down to the maximalist shoe, A is a preference, but B works along one of the 4 matrices. If you go from raised heel to flat, that's a win. From narrow toe box to wide toe box, that's a win. From stiff midsole to flexible midsole, that's a win. And then eventually from super maxed cushion to thinner cushion, that's a win. And that transition gives you a steady on-ramp to a healthier shoe, and eventually that also supports your foot getting stronger within the shoe. So in summary, remember, there's a difference between competition and training shoes. When it comes to competition, you're training for output and force, that's a different decision. When it comes to a healthy shoe, it's flat, wide, flexible, and thin-ish. And there's always a benefit of having toe separated shoes, especially wearing toe socks. There's a bunch of different shoes you can get out there, so I'm not gonna list specific brands because those are changed and I don't wanna be liable to specific companies in the future and they're always shifting. But I will say, if you find a pair of shoes you love, buy a bunch of pairs because companies are always shifting and they always have this designed obsolescence. And that means that the shoe you love this year might be gone or outdated or changed next year. And if you remember from part 1, we have our 3-part checklist of running. Can you move your feet? Can you jump? And can you sprint? And now we've covered the logistics of shoes in part 2. We're ready to go to part 3, which is how to deal with the pain and discomfort of running and how to deal with those little aches that pop up along the way. We'll see you there.